This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. How many of you had a set of encyclopedias growing up or remember looking at them at the library? Now that there is so much information online, many of those encyclopedias are gathering dust. But do you trust online sites like Wikipedia? Today, Where We Live, we dig in. This month, Wikipedia turns 20. The popular nonprofit site is run by the Wikimedia Foundation. Coming up, we find out more about the many volunteers, the people editing these Wikipedia pages, and how some users have been working to improve the site, addressing gender disparities. We want to hear from you. Do you use Wikipedia often? Do you have questions about it? You can join our conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. My first guest today on Zoom is Molly White. She's a longtime Wikipedia editor based in Boston. Molly, welcome to the show.
Hi, good morning.
Now, I mentioned that there are many volunteers editing Wikipedia pages. The Washington Post says there are 270,000 active editors a month. That's a lot. So tell me, when did you find that you wanted to be part of this Wikipedia community?
I joined Wikipedia when I was pretty young. I was probably 13 or 14 years old, and I stumbled across it, I think, sometime and realized that I could edit it myself. So I signed up and made a couple of edits just to, my hometown and things like that, and then sort of left it alone for a while and then rediscovered it a little bit in sort of the late high school years. And that's when I became a pretty active editor and have remained active for about 10 years since then.
When you said that you rediscovered it, what were some of the topics that you were interested in editing pages on?
When I sort of first started editing, it was a lot of things that I was just interested in then. So, bands I liked, that kind of thing. But I pretty quickly became someone who just sort of like wanders around the site, I think, and edits things that I discover. So I've never really had a very strong topic area interest. I mostly just find pages that need improvement and sort of go from there.
That sounds like a lot of time and energy to contribute into Wikipedia. What is it about this site that keeps you wanting to go back and be a part of it?
I would say I'm definitely motivated by just the desire to provide a freely available sort of information resource to people. I think free, accessible knowledge is really, really important. And, anything I can do to make knowledge more available to people who might not otherwise have as much access to it is very important to me.
When anyone does a search on the internet, often a Wikipedia page is one of the first ones to pop up. It's a very popular site. But how does Wikipedia work through the idea that because it's a free site and the fact that people can edit topics that they are interested in, like how do you handle whether pages have maybe erroneous information or people are using it to post on fairly contentious topics?
So we definitely have issues with that where people will come and introduce either false information or just outright vandalism. But there's also a large community of editors who are just very careful to keep pages up to date and accurate. So we use a lot of tools, both automatic programs and sort of semi-automatic programs to revert vandalism that comes in. So we have, bots and things like that that will identify edits that are likely to be unproductive. And then as far as things like disinformation, we keep a pretty close eye on pages that we think are particularly prone to that. So, in topic areas like, say, American politics, where things are pretty contentious, there's a lot of editors who take a lot of time to make sure that, the edits coming in are well-sourced to reliable sources, that they're neutral, and that they're not introducing, falsehoods or things like that.
So anyone can edit Wikipedia, but if there's someone like you, Molly, who's been editing for some time, is there a certain type, the fact that you have, I guess, more abilities to work and edit on pages than, say, someone who's a newbie?
To some extent. So for pages that are really, really contentious, we protect them from editing by the very, very new editors, which does sort of help us stem some of the vandalism. So we have different levels of protection that prevent pages from being edited by people who are extremely new or sort of new. And so at that point, those people can still suggest changes to those pages. We never want to completely prevent people from improving pages. But it's only people like me who've been editing for a little bit longer who can actually edit the pages directly and introduce those changes.
When anyone looks at a Wikipedia page, they can see how heavily sourced a lot of the pages are. And that's very different from if I log on to my Facebook page or Twitter. People can send out anything and you don't see like exactly where they're getting that information from.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's definitely one of our strengths as far as disinformation online. People can say anything on Twitter and it could be something they've made up. It could be something they saw in a very reliable source and you have no idea. But on Wikipedia, there always should be, that little number at the end of the sentence that shows exactly which source it came from. So that anyone, an editor or just a reader, can go and verify that whatever they're reading is in fact coming from a reliable source.
Now, I mentioned social media. I understand that there is a system in place with the Wikipedia community where if you're seeing certain articles being shared, you're tracking that to make sure that it's not being abused, that information.
To some extent, I think some editors do that on their own. It's something I do a little bit. I sort of keep an eye on, mentions of Wikipedia on, say, Twitter, and just sort of look to see if those articles are being edited, or, if sometimes people will vandalize an article and then share it on Twitter and show like, look what I did, and I'll often see those and go and fix them. But yeah, we do try to keep an eye on those like particularly sort of high trafficked pages because they can be targets for vandalism or misinformation.
When you use the term vandalized, do you mean people who are going in and almost in a sense pranking that page, putting in something that might be silly or definitely not right, but not necessarily malicious?
Yeah, I definitely use the term vandalism to refer to sort of, it's usually fairly innocent. It's things like, Molly was here, and things like that people will try to introduce to these articles. And I definitely distinguish that from things like disinformation, which is, intentionally trying to edit an article so that you're misleading people. And, it's not usually something that's, the high school student who doesn't want to complete their homework and is bored and so wants to vandalize what they're looking at. I definitely distinguish those two.
You're hearing Molly White here on Where We Live. She's a longtime Wikipedia editor as we talk about this online encyclopedia, again, that turns 20 this year. It has changed a lot since its beginning days. And we want to hear from you if you have a question about Wikipedia, if you're a frequent user, or maybe you wonder about how reliable some of the information is that you've read on Wikipedia. You can join us 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Molly, I was curious when breaking news happens and when we look at the riot and the mob that stormed the U.S. Capitol just a few weeks ago, when something like that is happening, can you walk us through how that information, how a page is created about that particular event happening, and how many editors are we talking about that are continuing to compile information as something is breaking?
Absolutely. So that particular page was created by an editor who has created quite a few articles actually about various Trump rallies, both pro-Trump and anti-Trump rallies. And they were watching as this situation sort of unfolded in the Capitol because it began as a rally. And so they were watching the news and saw that, people had gathered in DC, that various people, including then President Trump, had given some speeches. And then people started to march towards the Capitol. And when they saw that there were some evacuations at the Capitol because people had begun to break past security, they realized that this was maybe not just some, standard Trump rally that might not necessarily be notable enough for a Wikipedia article. And they realized like this is actually something that's going to have lasting notability. And so that's when they created the article on what came to be known as the 2021 storming of the U.S. Capitol. I actually joined them in editing that page because they had posted to a page that I've worked on in the past. They posted to the talk page of that article, which is where we sort of coordinate changes to say, hey, I've created this new article about this event that's happening. So I went and started to just do some very standard copy editing, formatting changes. At the time, I didn't think it was actually notable enough for an article. I thought this is probably going to be deleted. It's just a rally. Like, what's the point? But very shortly after I began editing, I found out, and other editors found out, that people had actually broken into the Capitol building. And that's when people, many editors began to join us in updating this page sort of in real time as news broke about what was happening in DC.
And the
So at the
challenge, Molly,
beginning,
I was just
what was
thinking
that?
the
Sorry.
challenge. I was thinking the challenge of when there's breaking news, as someone, when you work in the news business, is that sometimes what's being reported early ends up not being accurate, and so the constant having to update that. And so, do you see that also as well when you're sourcing particular media outlets, but as the information is changing and being confirmed, that's being constantly updated on Wikipedia?
Absolutely. Yes. So we definitely see, breaking news sources. We actually have policies on Wikipedia where we consider breaking news to be slightly less reliable than sort of non-breaking news stories for that very reason, because those really preliminary reports are sometimes inaccurate. So we'll often go and replace those sources later on when there's sort of more time, passed since the event, and the sources become a little bit more reliable.
Can you give us an idea of some other events or where you've seen a lot of traffic on a page, and you have to continually be in that editing process? And what happens? I'm just thinking with January 6th now past us, there's still information coming out. And can you walk us through how those pages are continuing to be updated?
Definitely. So, to answer your first question, I've definitely worked on a handful of articles that were very sort of, you know, high traffic because they were breaking news. The ones that come to mind most recently have to do with the November election. So, the night of the election, some people were expecting that results would be published that night because that's historically what's happened. But obviously this year that didn't happen. But those pages were still very highly edited, both around the presidential election, but also around the other, senatorial elections that were happening. So those were very heavily edited. And then to answer your other question, we do continually revisit articles about breaking news stories to update them, with later information that happens, because these events, eventually form a place in history. And there are always, reactions to the event that we need to document, or legislation that happens because of the event. In this case, there were people who were injured at the event who, were later either they recovered or some people passed away. We needed to cover that as well. So there's always sort of the event that's happening that day on January 6th, but then there's always the sort of aftermath of that event that we need to cover as well. And so that page on the storming of the Capitol is still being very, very heavily edited, even as I speak.
You can join our conversation as we talk more about Wikipedia. If you have questions about the online encyclopedia, you can join us at 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Fred is calling from Collinsville. Fred, what's your question?
Yes, good morning. Sometimes you'll have a topic that is very controversial historically, where two sides have a diametrically opposed interpretation. Like, let's say, the Armenian genocide. I can envision where you would have, for lack of a better term, I'm going to say edit wars, where one side would put up some edits with their interpretation, followed immediately by another side with their interpretation erasing the first side's. So how do you handle something like that, where there's, like I say, two sharply different interpretations of what's going on, and edit wars might result?
Great question, Fred. Go ahead, Molly.
That's a great question. And edit wars is exactly what we call it, actually. With articles like that, where there's no sort of accepted truth, there's two very different, or more than two, even very different interpretations of, a subject. We do something where we basically cover the controversy. So we will say, there's this side which believes this thing, and then there's this side which believes this thing. And we'll try to explain just that there are different views on this subject, and these are what they are. But you're right that they do attract people who wish, that we would only describe their side of the conflict. And so in those very contentious subject areas like the Armenian genocide, that's a great example, we do enforce some rules around editing a little bit more strongly than we do in other topic areas. So in some cases, you need to have a certain number of edits or an account that's been active on Wikipedia for a certain amount of time before you're allowed to edit those pages directly. And up until that point, you're only allowed to suggest changes on the talk page, which is very similar to what we do with American politics as well.
So when we think about these edit wars, again, volunteers are editing these pages. And so for something like the Armenian genocide, will you see Wikipedia editors consulting like academic experts for more information if it's continuing to be contentious and there are those factions saying we should include this, we should include this?
Absolutely. And I would say that some of the people who are editing these pages are themselves experts. There are some people who are both academic experts who decide they wish to contribute their knowledge to Wikipedia. And so those people are very, very helpful in topic areas that the layman may not be super familiar themselves.
You can join our conversation again as we talk about Wikipedia, 888-720-9677. Todd's calling from Milford. Todd, go ahead.
Hi, yes. In regards to what you consider reliable sources, I was curious about your fact-checking process. Are there some sources that are kind of flagged as unreliable or more reliable?
Molly?
Yep. So we go with consensus, basically, among Wikipedia editors. So if there's a source and we're not sure, if we should consider it reliable or not, we'll have a big discussion about it. And the consensus of those discussions is what we will go with. So we do have lists of what we call perennial sources that are basically just very frequently cited sources, very common news sources like the New York Times or NPR, for example. And we record the results of those consensus so that people can just look at a glance like, okay, this is a reliable source, or sometimes it's reliable for this topic area, but not another topic area. And then we do also have sources that we know you should really never use. So there are some sources that we consider to be generally unreliable, and we flag those so that we can avoid using them in general in articles.
And could you give examples of what you would consider unreliable?
So some of the sources that we've decided through these discussions that are generally unreliable are things like the Daily Mail. Breitbart is another one. Basically just sources that don't have a great reputation for fact-checking or sometimes will outright publish falsehoods.
You're hearing Molly White here on Where We Live, a longtime Wikipedia editor based in Boston, Massachusetts. Coming up, we're going to hear about an initiative in the Wikipedia community to create and improve information about Black culture and history. And we learn how some users are working to address the site's gender disparities. Now, do you use Wikipedia regularly? What questions do you have? You can join us as well. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. Wikipedia turns 20 this year, and today we talk about the community of volunteer editors who contribute to Wikipedia's more than 55 million user-created articles. Kathy tweeted, "Wow, can you imagine a world without Wikipedia now?" I remember as a child going through old encyclopedias at the library and at home. Now, the Washington Post reports the site struggles with diversity among its editors, and less than 20 20% of those editors identify as women. So what's happening to change that? Joining us now on Zoom is Sherry Antwine, Executive Director of AfroCrowd, a Wikimedia initiative to improve engagement of people of African descent in Wikipedia in both content and editorship. Sherry, welcome to the show.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. So you are technically a Wikipedian, is that the term?
Yeah, Wikipedian or Wikipedia editor, and I'm also one of the organizers, the many organizers who are involved with the platform.
So before you got really involved with Wikipedia, tell me when you first started using it and what was your reaction?
I came to Wikipedia as a user first, which I think is the experience of most people. It is one of the top international resources in the world, the largest volunteer community in the world, and the largest encyclopedia, online. And I remember using it in grad school, and then later on I joined AfroCrowd, founder Alice Backer, who started AfroCrowd in 2015 during what's coming to be our 6th anniversary Black Wiki History Month. And I joined her about 4 months after she started the initiative.
So tell us more about AfroCrowd. So you mentioned Alice Backers. I believe she's an attorney, and she saw that there just wasn't a lot of content reflecting the African diaspora as well as the people editing these pages. So how did you get involved with AfroCrowd, and tell us about the people in this community today?
Right. So before I started organizing with AfroCrowd, I was very interested in the interplay of the internet and society. So the internet and how it's affecting the way we see the world. And I was involved in leading another women's group. And that's actually where I met Alice. She was a part of our mailing list, and I heard her call out for an event that she was holding focused on Black History Month. And it turns out that, she was looking for someone to partner with her in this. And it was just supposed to be, a few months that I would help out with the initiative, but I got hooked, and 6 years later, I'm its executive director. And we have gone from being a meetup in the New York area to holding events throughout the country at different universities, different organizations. And now we have partners in different parts of the world. We have been in different countries. We've gone to virtually and in person to places like South Africa, to Ghana, to throughout different parts of Europe, Sweden. And now we are, throughout the pandemic, we are holding events online. And from 2015, we've held one Wikipedia event a month, every month for the last 6 years, and sometimes more than that. So you can imagine we've reached hundreds of people, actually thousands of people. And those groups have then gone out and edited thousands of articles which have been viewed millions of times. So it's been an extraordinary and rewarding experience. And this year, especially with all that's been going on in the Black community, but just in the world in general, we've been very busy.
So after George Floyd's killing, when you talk about what's been happening this year among communities of color and with the activism and protesting around our country, when you're thinking about this AfroCrowd community and ways to increase editors as well as the content that better reflects our country's population, give us some examples of this editathon that you held after George Floyd's death.
Yes, that was quite a response and quite a momentous time in the history of the Wiki community, I believe, as well as the world. When this happened, it affected not just people in the United States, but it affected people all over the world. We saw protests and marches, both here and abroad. And this event, our Juneteenth event, which was held June 19th this past year, is an event that we've held more than once. Every year we have something for Juneteenth, which is the day of celebration of the emancipation of enslaved peoples in America. And so this year would not have been any different, except for what we saw happening around us. We knew we had to expand it. So it went from being a one-day edit-a-thon, and edit-a-thons are events where you come and you learn how to edit. You meet other people who are also on their editing journey, and you work together. But this time around, we decided to make it a conference, which went for an entire weekend. We partnered with other great groups in the Wiki community, like Women in Red, another group that I'm working with that focuses on Black-owned newspapers, News on Wiki, and others, and other Wiki coaches and people like Molly who are expert Wikipedians who can help others to not only learn to edit and improve editing, but also to kind of talk about the relationship between Wikipedia and the sharing of knowledge of things that happen like this. We focused on civil rights. We had a great speaker from Spelman, Alexandria Lockett, who has been a Wikipedian for many, many years and uses it in her teaching. We had librarians. We had people from 8 different countries. We even had someone come in from a group of women come in from Nigeria who brought their own Hausa translator. We did this all on Zoom over more than one day for over a couple of days, and then some editing after. And out of that, many articles were edited, and from there, we had other groups contact us to do more. We've worked with the Dominican American community. We've worked with, we even had people from NPR join us later on for an edit-a-thon on the Black Indigenous People of Color community. We had Jen White, we had Elsa Chang join us for that event. And more recently, right around before the inauguration and right after the election, we joined people at Wikimedia's conference in North America, Wiki Conference North America, to hold an event that includes people in the Philadelphia and Pennsylvania area and join groups there. So you can see how communities come together to focus on information that needs to be added, as well as finds ways to help others grow in their Wikipedia journey and learning how to navigate starting articles, ensuring that they're well sourced and well edited, as well as taking a look at current events, as well as how they work together with past events, like ongoing issues like civil rights and so forth. So it's quite a community effort.
It certainly sounds like it. Sherry Antwine, again, is Executive Director of AfriCrowd. It's a Wikimedia initiative to improve engagement of people of African descent in Wikipedia in both content and editorship. You mentioned Molly. Molly White is still with us. She's a longtime Wikipedia editor based in Boston. Molly, I wanted you to respond to the work of the AfriCrowd community. Again, when we think about Wikipedia, it's been around for 20 years, but it's a site that has struggled with diversity among its editors. Many skew largely white and male. And so I'm wondering, especially for English language entries, I'm wondering if you could respond to how you've seen the pages change and the content in terms of who is notable and should have a page versus maybe 5-10 years ago who never would have been considered notable enough to be included in Wikipedia.
Yeah, so the work of groups like AfriCrowd has been really remarkable. So, when I was, 5 or 10 years ago, when I was first beginning to edit, it was sort of an accepted fact that, basically every editor you ran into was going to be a man, probably, and was probably going to be a white person from, either the United States or maybe Europe. And there was sort of, it was just kind of like, yeah, that's how things are. And in the past, handful of years, I would say we've definitely seen more attention being paid to the fact that, yes, this is a problem that exists, so let's do something about it. And so I would say that, yeah, the work of groups like AfroCrowd has made a major, difference in both the content of Wikipedia. We have more articles now about people of color, or, there's other groups like Wiki Project Women in Red, which focuses specifically on women. And I would say that, now your average editor is actually probably paying more attention to these things and considering when they go to nominate an article for deletion, or, vote in one of those discussions to delete an article, whether or not maybe there's bias coming into their decision making, and whether or not they would make a different decision. And I would say that there's definitely been a big change in the past couple of years on subjects like this.
You're listening to Where We Live, where we're learning about Wikipedia in its 20th year. Now, for another perspective on how Wikipedia can improve efforts to expand its content and make it more inclusive, Ari Rotremel is joining us. Ari is an assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and intersectionality studies at Connecticut College here in New London. Ari, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Lucy. Thank you for having me.
I mentioned you teach gender studies. So tell me how you talk about Wikipedia, but also engage with it with your class and your students.
Yeah, so particularly in my feminist theory class, I think about Wikipedia as both a resource, right, that students are always going to go to, but it's also an opportunity to think about how we can create knowledge together. And that's a really important question to think about when we're talking about theory and thinking about research.
When we mentioned that in the past there has not been a lot of diversity in those who are editing Wikipedia, including like the information, whether it skews to particular gender or geographic area or race. Is this something that your students have noticed before coming to your class? And then how do you talk about that within your class and how they're making note of this when they're on Wikipedia today?
I think for a lot of my students, Wikipedia feels like it's not touchable for them, right? So despite all of the efforts that Molly and Sherry and folks like them have done, right, there, I think still is a popular understanding that maybe I don't think I can become an editor. So my students often come to class not thinking about how they can participate. So that's sort of the first thing we do is really talk through why that matters. And we look at the research that is out there about sort of bias and the issues of representation within the content and the editors of Wikipedia. So it's kind of a process of talking about that, thinking about the stakes, and that can really serve students well in terms of motivating them as we start to dig into Wikipedia and add content ourselves.
Again, I wanted to ask you, Molly, this issue of neutrality, can it be used by some to keep certain knowledge off of the online encyclopedia? How do you counter that?
It certainly can. And I think there's a problem somewhat in the policies around neutrality, which is that we require articles to reflect all views that have been published in reliable sources, and we require them to be sort of proportional to how represented those views are, which means that if a view has not been represented in reliable sources, it can't be represented in Wikipedia. And so in cases where there is basically missing knowledge, or if knowledge is represented in ways that are not considered to be reliable, it will be missing on Wikipedia as well. So we've run into this in the past with communities that have very like verbal histories that don't necessarily have a lot of published records about their communities. They go very underrepresented in Wikipedia because we can't use those verbal histories as reliable sources. The issue of neutrality is also sometimes it can be used sort of to, it can be weaponized, I think, a little bit, in that some people will misunderstand our neutrality policy to mean that Wikipedia articles should have no point of view. or that they should treat two things equally, which is actually not what the policy requires. But this is such a common misunderstanding that it can be reflected in articles sometimes.
The issue of neutrality and having balance, this is something that we talk about a lot in our newsroom, and journalists are debating it today. Sherry, I wanted to bring you back into the conversation. When we think about even the media sources that are often seen as reliable, that are sourced onto Wikipedia, we know that in the news media, there is an issue of also representation and what communities are covered and how they are covered. And so that can be, I guess, tricky as well for Wikipedia editors as you're, going back and forth on editing particular pages when certain communities have been left out of the conversation.
Right. And so I'm actually working with a partner in the Wiki community, Pete Forsyth, on something called News on Wiki, which focuses on just that kind of dilemma, as well as the dilemma of recognizing whether something is reliable or not. A lot of newspapers, local newspapers, can be left out of this conversation, especially Black-owned newspapers. And there are a lot of regional newspapers that are also left out too, in, for example, smaller countries like those you might find in the Caribbean. So throughout this past year, we've been working on connecting with Wikipedians on editing information on local newspapers. This is a project that's been going on this past year, but it also began in infancy about 2 years ago with just general local newspapers. So there is efforts to improve, and expand, what we understand of as, reliable sources. I'm also, AfroCrowd has been looking at ways to perhaps use oral knowledge. We're not there yet. We've about back in 2007, 2 years ago, we connected with Columbia University's Oral History Master's Program to kind of see ways that perhaps we can use oral knowledge, if not as a citable source, as something that can be included in the lexicon. For example, we held an oral history recordathon in New York with students at LaGuardia College and people in the community to, get some samples of oral knowledge. We worked with another group called Wiki Tongues. I love mentioning these groups because we just want to let the people know there's lots of ways to interact with Wikipedia and learn about it and connect with it. But this oral history edit fund, this oral history recordathon, we collected audio and video clips from people, and we put them on Wiki Commons. Wiki Commons is a sister or a cousin of Wikipedia, and it works together with Wikipedia as a way to grab either images or audio or visual information and attach them to articles. So in that way, at least you can think of oral knowledge as being included in the article, even though it's not the citation. You can go through Wiki Commons and find different things that you can add to an article to kind of give an expanded understanding of it. We're still in the process of working on it and trying to figure out ways to better that. But so we are, the community is aware of the issue, and there are definitely groups that are working on trying to solve or address it.
I need to,
I also want to add,
Sherry, quickly, I need to take a break, but it's really been interesting to hear you talk about
Sure.
some of these other ways of including, again, sources on Wikipedia. Again, we're talking about Wikipedia in its 20th year with my guest. You just heard Sherry Antwine, Executive Director of AfroCrowd. This is a Wikimedia initiative. Molly White's here, a longtime Wikipedia editor based in Boston, and Ari Rotramel, Assistant Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Intersectionality Studies at Connecticut College. When we come back from the break, I want to hear more from Ari about the work in the class where students are learning about, seeing knowledge gaps and working to edit their own pages. I want to talk more about that after the break and take your calls too. We'll be back. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're focused on Wikipedia, and my guests include Ari Rotremel, an assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and intersectionality studies at Connecticut College in New London. Ari, you were talking about your students and how they are evaluating Wikipedia in the classroom, learning to edit their own pages when they see these gaps in knowledge. Can you give us some examples of pages that, again, people that we may not know about, and having to prove that they're notable, they should be included?
What's so amazing is there's just really endless opportunities. And one person that I had a student add information about was Ellie Coppola, who was a poet, an activist who also was a Connecticut College undergrad student. And she didn't have a page on Wikipedia. So I had a student who was really interested in her, able to look at her work that we have in the archives at the college. And so she created a page from scratch.
And when she was able to include this, how did the other wiki editors react to it? Was there the edit wars, so to speak?
What I found that's pretty interesting is in that case, there wasn't a lot of conflict. And sometimes it's really when people start making changes to existing pages. So one example that I have, which is, to me, was a little stunning, was Audre Lorde, who's a famous Black feminist poet. One of my students added that she identified as a lesbian on her page. And, you know, she often wrote and identified as a Black lesbian mother warrior poet, right? That's sort of how she named herself in essays. And an editor flagged that and tried to erase it because they thought that including her sexual identity was offensive.
That's interesting. And how did the students respond to that feedback?
My students often, in class, you know, they'll get frustrated and they're kind of be like, well, these people I don't know are picking on me. But we talk it through and we talk about that that's kind of a really important lesson. How do you push back? In other cases, it's really about you need to present the information to support that point, right? So going back in and sort of saying, here's the evidence, just like Molly and Sherry have been talking about, right? You need to find and sort of help other folks understand that this is documented, this is relevant, and it's an important thing to have available to the public.
Molly, I wanted to bring you back in. You're a longtime Wikipedia editor. We know that the Wikimedia, which is the parent organization, has acknowledged issues like sexual harassment and doxing that have been a problem, again, with depending on what people are working on and pushback on particular pages and who the people's identities. And I'm just wondering how Wikipedia is handling that. And does that hurt bringing more diverse editors on to work in this community, people who have been marginalized or targeted in the past?
Yeah, it's absolutely an ongoing problem. And we definitely do what we can to try to address harassment within the Wikipedia community. So, there are places where you can go to say, hey, I've been having trouble with this editor, and try to have those disputes resolved. And I would say there's definite gaps there in dealing with harassment on Wikipedia within the community. But there are also major issues around the fact that if someone is harassing someone on Wikipedia, the most we can really do is ban them from editing Wikipedia. But that doesn't necessarily stop the harassment. So they could go somewhere else, like Twitter, or to some off wiki, we call it, venue, and continue that harassment. And that's where our ability to stop that sort of ends. And I would say that really does limit bringing new editors in, especially people of marginalized communities, because it's really hard to say, hey, we have this issue with underrepresentation. We need more women editors or people of color or members of the LGBTQ community to come help us edit so that, things are better represented. But, if you're a woman or if you're queer, you're going to be subjected to this harassment. It's really hard to make that argument, right? And it's really hard to justify, asking people to do that kind of work with you if you know that they're going to be put at risk. So I would say that's definitely an issue with the community.
Richard's calling from New Haven. Richard, we just have a couple minutes left. Quickly with your question.
Yeah, hi. I'm an academic researcher, and I'm working in a field that's changed a lot in the last few years. So I rewrote one of the pages, which was, I thought, obsolete, and my rewritings were just wiped clean by an editor who's not been keeping up with the field. And I'm wondering what the recourse is and how to go forward and argue what I think to be the changes in the research field.
Molly, go ahead.
Sure. So in cases like that, we usually encourage people to go to the talk page of that article and sort of make a case for their changes, presenting any sort of reliable sources and usually, explaining that, hey, things have really changed and this page is outdated. Sometimes if there's an editor, if a page is not heavily edited, you won't get a whole lot of response. And so in those cases, we definitely encourage you to go to what we call the notice boards. So there's various notice boards you can go to, depending on if it's a neutrality issue or if it's just sort of a general content issue, to get outside opinions.
I wanted to end with... recommend. Thank you, Molly. I wanted to end with going back to Ari Rotremel again from Connecticut College. You wanted to make a point quickly.
Yeah, I think in terms of this issue around harassment, that's why, for me, I often have students use pseudonyms, and it's actually an opportunity to talk about exactly what Molly mentioned, right? That we're living in a world where harassment can travel across social media. So this is a way to sort of talk about what does that mean? What does it mean to sort of engage in a online world? And I think even to this last point, right? How to have me or not to support you as you're editing Wikipedia.
Well, it's been a really interesting conversation. I never thought about a lot of this when I've been doing some Google searches on particular topics, but it's been a really enjoyable hour to learn about the Wikipedia community. Thank you so much, Ari Rotremel, for the work you're doing in your classroom at Connecticut College, Assistant Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Intersectionality Studies. Also, Sherry Antwine is here, Executive Director of AfroCrowd and a Wikimedia Initiative, and we're going to share some information about a Black History Month event on our social at Where We Live. But thank you, Sherry, for your time. And Molly White, longtime Wikipedia editor based in Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you, Molly. Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. You can learn more about the show. Just download Where We Live on your favorite podcast app. Tomorrow we're digging into some Connecticut history. Have you heard of Venture Smith? We'll talk about him with historian Elizabeth Norman.